All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining NYSEIA's webinar on the new interconnection rules in New York for developers. My name is Valessa Suderklein, and I recently started as the policy coordinator for the New York Solar Energy Industries Association, or NYSEIA. In just a couple of minutes, I'm going to pass the microphone off to Melissa Kemp and Dr. Bryce Smith, who are our co-presenters today. And it looks like we have a good number of attendees on board, so I think we can go ahead and start. We have a pretty large agenda for you all today. Before we dive in, a couple housekeeping items. First, we are recording this webinar, and we will share it along with the slides after today's presentation. The slides are pretty text-heavy, and that's because they are intended to be shared with you all along with a guidance document that is currently under review. We do have a good number of folks on this call, so everyone is muted. Please do send us your questions. You can use the Ask a Question option in the navigator screen. If you have any trouble with that, try the chat screen. And we will save time for questions at the end of the presentation as well. So with that, a brief bit of background on NYSEIA. NYSEIA was founded in 1994, and we are the only statewide membership and trade association dedicated to advancing solar energy use in New York State. And we're led by an engaged and diverse board of directors. For those of you who may have joined and your organizations may not be members already, I do encourage you to learn more following this webinar. So I hope you will get in touch with me or Melissa Kemp as well. So our presenters today are Melissa Kemp and Dr. Bryce Smith. Melissa serves as the co-chair of the NYSEIA Policy Committee and on the NYSEIA board, and is also currently the Director of Government and Utility Affairs for Renovis Solar. Renovis Solar is a development, engineering, procurement, and construction firm based in central New York. She has focused and led efforts on state solar interconnection policy and solar property tax and the solar property tax situation. And most recently, she's been working on the interim successor tariff net metering proceeding, as well as the clean energy standard and utility billing issues. Melissa holds a BS from Princeton University. Also with us is Bryce Smith. Bryce is an associate professor of physics at SUNY Cortland and currently directs their graduate professional science master's program in sustainable energy systems. Bryce holds a PhD in physics from Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a BS in physics from Washington University in St. Louis. He is the co-founder and senior consultant with 3RE. Bryce, am I saying that correctly? Energy, I'll let him circle back to that. Energy Consulting in Ithaca, New York. Prior to joining SUNY Cortland, Smith worked as a senior scientist at the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research in Tacoma Park, Maryland. And before that, as an engineer working on aircraft electric power systems at Sunstrand Aerospace. So as you can see, we are fortunate to have both Bryce and Melissa's wealth of experience and expertise to draw on as we work to advance solar in New York State. And with that, I will pass today's presentation off to Melissa.
Great. Thank you, Valessa. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining NYSEIA's webinar on the latest developments in interconnection and the new SIR. Before we jump into the initial part of the presentation, which I will lead, I just wanted to review the agenda for today's webinar so people had a sense of where we're headed and what's going to be included today. We are going to just quickly touch on the importance of the SIR, what's been the kind of interconnection status to date. The main focus of this webinar is the new SIR, which will first talk about the steps in the new process, and then dig into the technical screens in the new process and both the rationale as well as the implementation of them. And then we'll wrap up with just talking quickly about the state of the interconnection queue and future queue management, and then other issues going forward, including the interconnection technical working group, dispute resolution, enforcement mechanisms, etc. So with that, as Valessa kindly said, if you have questions throughout, please type them into the control panel. If we can, we'll answer some along the way, but we definitely will get to questions at the end of the session, no matter what. So to start off with, everyone on this call, most folks on this call are developers. I should mention that we also invited the Joint Utilities and Department of Public Service to join this call as well. just because our goal for rolling out the new SIR is to have everyone on the same page. And we've been working very cooperatively with both of those groups since last summer, leading to this point. So really, obviously our membership is a huge part, developers and other organizations, but those folks have also been so involved that we've invited them to this event as well. So everyone, I'm sure, is familiar with what the SIR is. We're talking about interconnecting solar and other distributed generation to the distribution system here in New York. And this is the set of rules that determines procedures, technical requirements, processes and timelines, as well as how costs are looked at for accomplishing that goal for individual projects. As I know most of you also know, this has been underway, this work to update the SIR in New York since last year, particularly since last summer, culminating in the Public Service Commission update March 17th. And then the new SIR just went into effect last Friday, the 29th of April. And if anyone has not already seen the new SIR, there's a link to it in this presentation. You can also pretty easily find it online. It's on DPS's distributed generation page. And the full order, including the Commission's comments and rationale for all the changes that they made, is available in the docket shown there. So how did we get here? Just really quickly, most of us are familiar with this. So before this new update, we were having multiple sets of challenges with interconnection. One was no way to get information on circuits up front. The only way to get information was to put an application and actually get into the interconnection queue, which has all sorts of ramifications. We were having a lot of delays, in part driven by other regulatory changes. We had different technical standards being used by different utilities across the state. To evaluate whether something needed further study or could go straight to contract. There was a wide variety of costs and kind of fluctuation, contingencies in costs for upgrades across the state. And we also have had very limited queue management processes before now. So just to outline the SIR basic structure before we dive into part one, I'm going to focus on the process updates. But the basic sections of the SIR for folks who don't read it continuously, the first section is about process. The second section has some additional technical information. The third is a glossary, and then appendices A through G in the new version are the important forms that you'll use throughout the process stages. So let's dive into the new process. So what we're focused on here, the biggest changes in the new SIR are for systems greater than 50 kilowatts, now up to 5 megawatts. And before we go any further, let me just say something about the 5 megawatts. A lot of people have asked this question. What does it mean to have the SIR now apply to 5 megawatt facilities? And what it means is basically that everyone was looking forward to a time where we may be connecting up to 5 megawatts per interconnection point to the distribution grid, but right now net metering projects, the cap still is at 2 megawatts per property tax parcel per interconnection point. So the 5 megawatts right now probably will not be used very often in terms of a project size, but it is there just for the future. So just FYI, so there's no confusion, net metering is still 2 megawatts per interconnection point and property tax parcel. But this is kind of designed to be used hopefully in the future as things continue to evolve. So we are not focused here on there were not a lot of changes to the smaller system process, which has been working, relatively well. There have definitely been, some delays and other things, but generally it's been a simple process that's not caused a lot of concern. That process remains under 50 kilowatts, remains pretty much unchanged. So these steps I'm going to walk you through are all for the larger projects, commercial, industrial, community projects. So the first thing that changed is step 2, which the pre-application report is now something that is allowed and included under the SIR. So as I mentioned before this new SIR, there was no way to get information on circuits without putting in an application. Now there is the pre-application report, and I can't stress how important this pre-application report is. So it's Appendix D in the new SIR, and I'll show you a picture of it. Basically what it lets you do as a developer is ask for information about a circuit without putting in a full report and without putting in a full application, without having to put in drawings, etc., and also without having to have a customer name and without having to take a place in the interconnection queue. And all of those are really helpful. It should be quicker, easier to do, and you're not taking a place in the queue when you may not actually be interested in developing a project at that location. You are looking for information. So we expect this to be a big help. It includes 13 key pieces of information that I'll show briefly on the next page, and then Dr. Smith will talk more about later on. The cost for this pre-application report is $750. The utility has 10, or the utilities have 10 business days to turn around this report to you. And then you can also, typically I'll talk about in a moment, use that $750 potentially towards an application later on. One thing to mention here, as with any timelines, the timelines throughout the entire SIR, the timelines start when you pay for whatever the step is. So if I submit a pre-application report request today, but I don't deliver my $750 till 2 weeks from now, the 10 business day clock starts 2 weeks from now. So the importance of payments payment timing is important, and utilities, a lot of the utilities are now offering or have been offering online or digital payment options, which can really speed that up and make it much more convenient. And the pre-application report is really obviously key because this information, as we'll walk through, can really allow you to determine preliminarily whether you're likely to pass the screening we're going to talk about, the initial screening, the supplemental screening, and or whether you're likely to require a full study. And if you do need a study, what kind of, are you likely to trigger high cost improvements or something that is likely manageable? So there's a lot of value in this information. And here is that list. It's Appendix D, as I mentioned, in the new SIR. This is the top half of it. Right here is the information that you're providing to get the report, which is very basic. Again, the customer name part we're getting clarification on, but you do not have to generally put a customer name to use this. And the question is whether you need to have one to get the credit for the $750, which we'll be clarifying hopefully shortly. But the pre-application report will then return to you this information down here. And it includes a lot of things, simple things like, of course, what kind of phase and what kind of voltage the circuit is, but really important things like peak load, exact minimum load if known, the substation peak load, distance from the substation, etc. So there's some great information there. Also information about the DG that is currently installed on the circuit, as well as any DG that's queued for the circuit. So next step that had some important changes, the actual application submission. So if you are successful and you have a good pre-application report results, it looks like a feasible location, or if you already know a circuit and it's going to be likely feasible, the next step is then to put in a formal application. As in the past, they still require a customer name if you're not a CDG project, but there is now an official checklist of basically the same similar documents to what was required before. Plus, if you're doing a new project on a new site, they now ask for a very simple site plan, using aerial imagery. But generally, this is very similar to the way it's been. The cost is $0 if you choose to exercise and do this application within 15 business days of getting the pre-application report back. If you do not, it's just $750. And like the utilities have had previously, they have 15 business days to turn around a response to this application to you, which we call a preliminary review. And if you do not submit a completed application, this is the beginning of several timelines that have been started here that are actually much more binding, in the sense that before this SIR update, it was very difficult for you to get kicked out of the queue. We didn't really have a very strong queue management process. Basically, if your application was in for a year and became inactive, you could be removed in the past SIR. Starting in this new SIR, this is the first example of several places where there are binding timelines with teeth that if you do not meet them, you will be removed, your project will be removed from the queue. And there are some more timelines that need to be added in here and need to be tweaked, but generally this is going to be the trend going forward so that we actually have a queue where projects can move forward and you're not stuck behind a bunch of things that aren't real or aren't moving. So here is that checklist in Appendix F. Basic familiar stuff, I'm sure, to all of you or most of you. Everything is pretty much as it was for actually the application, except there is a request for a site plan if you are connecting on a new parcel, and a small description if you have more than one project per site or multiple projects nearby each other. So the next step that has an update is step 4. And this is really one of the crucial things that Dr. Smith will talk a whole bunch about. So this is all about the actual screening. So as I mentioned, before the new SIR, New York did not have a standardized set of technical screens, preliminary or supplemental, that all projects get reviewed by. Utilities had just kind of their own kind of flavor based on their experience of screens. And they just, to try to make them consistent and uniform and understood by the developer community and consistent with other leading states, that's what this process has been about, and we now have a huge step towards that. So the preliminary review will now consist of 6 basic screens that all the utilities will do statewide. They're listed in Appendix G. Dr. Smith will go through them in detail, along with the rationale for them. And what these result in is a preliminary report, something similar to, in name, to what you have gotten in the past, but now actually showing you the results of these 6 screens. And you have 30 days after you get that back to decide what to do about it. Now, what are your options for doing about it? If you have passed the preliminary screens, the key point here is expediting projects. If you pass all 6 screens, you go straight to a contract, no CSER study, no further study, and no upgrade requirements, which is a huge, important thing. If you have failed 1 or more screens, you can have one of these several options, or several of them, if you choose to. One is you can have a meeting, which is called a preliminary analysis results meeting. Typically, those meetings are about, hey, I think I am just barely failing something here. Can we tweak something? For example, can I downsize this a tiny bit and pass all the screens? If there was one piece of equipment that needed to be upgraded, can I just take care of that? Basically, a really simple solution that would be easy to discuss with the utility and then go straight to a contract from there. If that's not feasible, one of your other options is a supplemental review, which if you exceeded or failed 1 or more screens by a slightly larger margin, but still based on your knowledge of the project and the location, you think it's likely that it could pass without a full study, there's a second set of technical screens that we'll review shortly. And this is really usually intended for projects under 1 megawatt who may have just barely tripped something but don't need to go through a full CSER study. There is a fee for that. It's about $2,500, and it's a 20-day business time turnaround, but it is much quicker and less expensive than a full study. And if neither one of those 2 things is a good option, or if you do one and it just doesn't work out or end up producing the results needed, you can always go to a full CSER study. So if you failed 1 or more screens and the other 2 solutions are not helpful, then you can go to a full CSER study, which we're all pretty familiar with. Of course, at any time, you can withdraw the application if something really unexpected comes up. So if a full CSER study is required, this gets into steps 5 and 6 in the new SIR. This is pretty similar to the previous SIR. As they have in the past, utilities have 60 business days to complete the CSER study. And if you're going to be doing projects over 2 megawatts, which is, like I said, not probably very likely at the moment, then they have up to 80 business days. And some of the changes in this section of the SIR really are mostly about description. As DPS I think says really well, just getting more information communicated to developers and as early on as possible. So more information about when the CSER comes out, what upgrades are required, why they're required, and then more detail on the cost estimates behind them or related to them. There is a limit also on the contingencies associated with cost estimates. They are now reduced in scope to being no more than plus 25%. And then next would be step 7, which this is, I think, an important improvement for the industry. So if you had to do a CSER or had upgrades coming from something else, then you have to actually pay for those upgrades. In the past, you had to pay 100% before you could actually execute your interconnection contract, and that is no longer the case. So going forward, as of last Friday, any project, when you get to this step of having, if you do have upgrades and you have to pay for them, you only have to pay for 25% of them in order to execute your interconnection contract. And this is really important because executing the interconnection contract is a placeholder in several ways. 1, it's important for financing. 2, it locks your place in the queue. And 3, it really is essential for locking in your property tax status as well. When the property tax laws were extended and updated in the summer of 2014, the trigger for locking in property tax status in a jurisdiction is the execution of an interconnection agreement. So being able to get that interconnection agreement more quickly without having to spend as much money up front when you may just still be completing the financing of a project is really, really helpful. You do have to pay the remainder of the cost, though, before you can actually have the utility construct anything, which is fine and makes sense. And you have 120 days to do that after taking care of the first 25% and getting the contract. So just to kind of step back then and sum up, so the kind of total times coming out of this new process, if you just exclude construction, because right now there are still no timelines around construction, But the simpler projects, which I would say are up to 1 megawatt at good sites, are about 40 to 75 business days is the time frame you're looking at on average. And for more complex projects, you're looking at 100 to 200 business days if you sum up all those timelines that I talked about. And there are some places when you're making decisions about how to handle, let's say after a preliminary review with an issue, there are some options in there that can extend or shorten timelines a bit. But generally, that's the kind of time frames that we're looking at. And one really common question that comes up all the time lately is, what about the new process versus old process in terms of how my projects are treated? So right now, the situation is that any project that has been, the application was submitted before last Friday is going to be treated under the old process. And any project that has an application submitted after last Friday will be treated under the new process. That being said, we know there definitely are many developers out there that have projects that would benefit from being treated through the new process. They may pass the preliminary screens and go straight to contract. They may pass the preliminary screens, have a small problem, and be able to be dealt with a meeting or supplemental review. And there are obviously other examples. So we've asked DPS to consider whether we could have developers select. We understand that it does not make sense for the utilities to go back and process thousands of applications all anew when all of them may not be active. But if developers could request which ones they would like to be reprocessed and pay for that in some way, I think that would be potentially very helpful. So we are working on that and would welcome your feedback on that and whether that would be helpful for you. And with that, I want to pass this over to Bryce Smith to kind of dig in a little bit more to the technical screens, both preliminary and supplemental, that I talked about in terms of why they exist in general and where they are in the process, but I didn't dig into them with any detail. And Bryce, I have passed the presenter to you.
Great, thank you. Can you see the slides okay?
Yes, I think we can see the slides, and just probably want to hear you a little bit louder.
Okay, great. So the overall rationale for the technical screens, as Melissa has mentioned, is that we have this overriding goal to maintain the safe and reliable functioning of the distribution system, while at the same time enabling systems that will not have impacts on safety or reliability to be interconnected more efficiently and more cost effectively. So the idea behind the screening analysis is to define this set of very conservative assumptions and conditions that if you pass below them, it is very unlikely that this system would require any further study to be interconnected safely to the distribution system. The current screening methodologies that are similar to what New York has just adopted trace their origins back to the late 90s, early 2000s, with California's Rule 21. These types of screens have been adopted broadly. There are a standard collection of 13 screens that, with some small modifications, have been adopted in a variety of jurisdictions, including California, Massachusetts, Hawaii, and in 2013 by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Of these 13 screens, 6 that are very similar to that collection are what was adopted as the preliminary review here in New York. So what we're going to do is look at each of those 6 preliminary screens in order, talk briefly about what their rationale is, and note a couple of questions and places where we're continuing to work on this. So screen A asks if the generator is connected to a network secondary system or not. And how each of the screens work is they essentially are a collection of yes/no questions, and depending on whether they're positive or negative questions, either yes or no is the pass. So in this case, if the system is not on a networked secondary condition section, then you pass the screen. And so the rationale behind this screen is that networked systems where you have multiple transformers feeding a section of line, and those transformers in turn have connections to multiple high voltage primaries, the power flows through this system are a great deal more complex than they are through a simple radial system where you have essentially a tree and branch type distribution where power flows in a much more regulated way, where you can really identify what are those minimum loads and it's less dynamic than in a networked system. Generally in a networked system, they are more complex, and therefore for systems over 50 kilowatts, we really do need additional study. So screen A is sort of unique amongst the screens in that if you fail the screen A, it really does eliminate much value in sort of all the other screens. And so generally failure of this means that you're likely to need to go to a detailed study for most network systems. And so this is one of the few screens. If you pass screen A, the utilities will continue on through the rest of the screening methodologies. And so even if you failed screens B or C, you'll still get results for all of them. Because as Melissa mentioned, maybe there are small tweaks, maybe there are things that you can do to address those failures, and you really do want to see how the whole screening analysis works for those systems that are on radio feeder lines. So screen B, fairly simple screen. It simply asks, is certified equipment used? It asks, does the interconnection propose to use equipment that's been listed on the UL 1741 for inverters and tested by recognized laboratories? So if you are using certified equipment, then you pass this screen. So the rationale behind this is it implements essentially a requirement that is sitting within the SIR already and within the new SIR. So in addition to all of the technical screens that we're going to talk about, there is Section 2 of the SIR. It has been updated since its previous incarnations, but it still has a similar structure. And they're the overall design requirements for a system. And so several of the screens reference back to some of these requirements and are explicit tests to make sure that you are meeting this. So within Section 2 there, they have the requirement for equipment certification. The screen C is where we start to really get into some of the detail. It asks, is the rating for any of the electric power system equipment exceeded? And so if it is, you fail. If not, you can pass. There are several screens like this, so it's worth noting that when looking at whether you exceed the rating of any of the equipment on the line, it's the total aggregate amount of DG. So it is your application plus all of the existing generation already interconnected to that circuit, plus all of the generators in the interconnection queue ahead of you in the system. And therefore, that is what we're going to reference whenever we talk about the aggregate DG. It's those three pieces all added together. And so if you exceed the rating of any of the equipment, switches, reclosers, what you will see is the list of all of the systems, what their rated capacity is, what the aggregate DG is, plus your system, and then you can see by how much, if at all, you exceed any of the ratings for that equipment. And so this is one of those screens where the preliminary results meeting that Melissa mentioned can be a very useful part of this new process. Because if you otherwise pass all of the screens that we're talking about, but you exceed the rating for one or two minor pieces of equipment, it may very well be to your benefit to have the meeting. You can agree to the upgrades, and then there are process and timelines within the SIR that the utility can provide you a cost estimate for those upgrades, and then you can choose whether to accept those upgrades or not as a result of your meeting. So this is one of those examples where that preliminary results meeting might be very useful. Screen D, it asks, is the line configuration compatible with your interconnection type? So this is going to show a table here, and it simply asks, is your proposed method of interconnection consistent with the existing distribution system? So this table is included in the SIR. So it has the three options, so three-phase, three-wire systems over 5 kV. Any three-phase type of interconnection is acceptable and you can pass. If you have a three-phase, four-wire system, so you have a grounded system, then you must interconnect with an effectively grounded three-phase system in order to pass. for all of these systems, interconnecting on single phase, phase-to-phase, or ineffectively grounded sources would cause you to fail. And this is one of those places where we have a question that we're going to work to clarify some of this language. I'll speak of that in a second. The intent of this screen is simply to ensure that your interconnection is compatible with the distribution system and that you don't introduce the potential for losing the ability to identify faults, weakening their sensitivity to fault detection, or to ground fault over voltage on the actual distribution system as well. And so what we have as a remaining question is that last line where it says under all primary distribution type lines, single phase interconnection would fail. And the question that NYSEIA hopes to work with DPS and utilities to clarify is to make sure that that language is not intended to exclude the ability to interconnect with a single phase system on a single phase line. There will be places where you may have systems that are over 50 kilowatts and therefore subject to this screening analysis on single phase points of interconnection. And so that is still one of the remaining questions about this piece. Screen E is likely to be the most significant of those preliminary results, preliminary analysis screens. It's the most likely screen to fail, and it's the most likely screen to interest you in looking at supplemental review. So this simplified penetration test says, is the aggregate DG, so your facility plus all of the existing plus the queued ahead of you, does that exceed 15% of the peak load on the circuit or the section of the circuit that is segmented by these automatic sectionalizing devices? So this screen is intended to be a sort of catch-all screen. If you are below 15% of peak load, it is taken that you will have very little likelihood of creating significant voltage, quality, or regulation impacts. The risk of unintentional islanding is not a concern. If you are below this 15% of peak load, all of the fault coordination issues, these are generally considered to be not a concern, and therefore you can interconnect without a full study. The origin of the 15% number comes from the fact that when they were developing screening methodologies, they looked at a variety of different feeder types, and what they saw was sort of as a rule of thumb, the minimum load on these circuits was on the order of about 30% of the peak load. And therefore, they took an engineering safety factor of 2, they reduced the 30% to 15%, and at that level, they argued that you would very likely be below the minimum load on the circuit, and none of these other types of concerns would be an issue. The peak load, because of the importance of this is one of those places where the pre-application report will first be of great use to you. Within that pre-application report that Melissa had discussed, there's a section which says the circuit peak load for the previous calendar year. So this is the load that we interpret to mean the relevant peak load for your point of interconnection, where you can take that pre-application report and in a very straightforward way, see whether you are likely to pass this screen, just fail it by a little, or are you well over this 15%. So as I mentioned, it's the most likely screen to be failed. I'll show you some numbers here in a sec. If this screen is failed by only a modest amount, if you're at 16, 17, 18% of peak load, as mentioned, that 15% is not the estimate for the minimum load, but was their estimate for the minimum load and then a factor of 2 to reduce it to make the screens conservative. So if you fail it just slightly, there's a supplemental review screen that will allow you to take a look at this in more detail, and it's one of those areas where supplemental review might be very important. So supplemental review, as Melissa mentioned, it will not be useful for all systems. You certainly wouldn't imagine sending all of your systems through it, but there is likely to be a sweet spot of systems in that 200 to 1 megawatt range, where on certain types of distribution lines with certain load profiles, they really will be a huge help to us. So while it's not currently available for all circuits, so depending on which utility territory you work in, some have a large amount of data already on their circuits and can tell you what the minimum loads actually were. Others are working on methods to estimate it. If they know the circuit minimum load or have previously calculated it within the last short amount of time, this is also something that will be explicitly provided to you within that pre-app report. The pre-application report, though, only requires the utility to give data that is pre-existing. So if they don't have this data already, then it won't come back as part of the pre-application report. So to give you a sense of how important this is a couple of numbers that IREC pulled from data in California. This is looking for the first couple of years after California updated their screens to include the supplemental review that we're going to talk about. And what they found is that for the two utilities, somewhere between 46 and 80% of the applications were failing these initial review, failing the initial screens. Of those, somewhere between 85 and 90% were failing because of that 15% of peak load screen. So this is obviously a very important screen to take a look at. The last of the preliminary results, preliminary screens, is screen F, the simplified voltage fluctuation test. It simply asks, can the generation parallel with the system without driving the system more than 5% of the prevailing voltage? And it's important to recognize that superseding all of these requirements is that Section 2 requirement that says you must retain the voltage within the ANSI limit. So even though it says at prevailing voltage, if this is a point where your voltage is already low, for instance, if 5% would drive you out of ANSI limits, that's a requirement that sits on top of these screens. And so the application of this will generally be that 5% of prevailing, but it is important to recognize that superseding requirement that lives in Section 2. The intent of this penetration is simply, again, to implement one of those requirements from the design requirements section. So in Section 2, under the design requirements, the voltage response notes that the facility has to be able to operate over the same range as before, 88 to 110, but it's added now this language that it shall not cause the voltage to deviate outside of the 95 to 105 levels. The last thing to note about this, in the PSC ruling, if you have read it, you will have noticed that at one point they make reference to moving in the voltage flicker analysis from the borderline of visibility to the borderline of irritation, which is the higher level. This, however, has been removed entirely from Section 2. The language under the power quality section that used to reference flicker has now been removed, and voltage flicker is now something that will be considered and analyzed within the context of supplemental screening, the supplemental review, or the CSER process. So supplemental review, if you fail one or more of those screens and it looks like you have confidence that there is a good probability that you can still interconnect without the requirement of a full impact study, you now have this option for supplemental review. The advantages of it, as Melissa had mentioned, is the price. It's $2,500 as a fixed fee, as opposed to the CSER studies, and it has a 20 business day timeline rather than the 60 business day timeline for the base CSER study. So if the system is unlikely to pass these screens, You don't have to go through supplemental review. The applicant is always able to opt to move straight to a CSER at any point during this process. They can take that as an off-ramp. But supplemental review is likely to be helpful for that sort of sweet spot of projects. The first screen is the one that generally is the most focused on. It's the supplemental penetration test. So as mentioned, the 15% is generally a very conservative estimate, and therefore the new screen is 100% of the minimum load. So if the minimum load is known from data, if it can be calculated, if it can be estimated from existing data, or if it can be modeled from power flow model, knowing the class of customers connected to that line, then you can pass this screen by moving up to as much as 100% of the minimum load. It's a more sensitive screen than that kind of blanket 15%. How much more than 15% it's going to be, if at all? Generally, these are above 15%. NREL did a study, and they looked at a sort of a collection of illustrative feeders. What they found was for that collection of feeders, 99% of them had actual relevant minimum loads for solar that were greater than 20% of peak load. But there are circuits where that won't be the case, and so that's the kind of consideration you have to make when thinking about moving to supplemental review. This is another place where that preliminary results meeting may be helpful. You want to get a better sense of what that minimum load is likely to be on a circuit. You can discuss more details about that circuit with the utilities. So the rationale for this, as I mentioned, is that 15% being a relatively conservative general answer, and for other circuits you're likely to see numbers that can be higher than that. It's also important to note that the screen does not require the data to exist for your particular line, but asks, can it be calculated, estimated, or determined from a power flow model? And so if the minimum load cannot be determined, if they can't make an estimate for a particular circuit, they would then explain why it wasn't able to do one of these three pieces. As Melissa mentioned, the hope and the goal for all of these screens is to help increase the information flow between the developer and the utility and make sure everyone is on the same page, reducing the load on the utilities from applications that aren't likely to result in useful projects, and help the developers interconnect more rapidly. So the only question mark that we have on this is in most other jurisdictions that use this type of screen, so for instance for California, Massachusetts, they use different time windows for the minimum load for solar and other types of distributed generation. So for solar, they look at what's called the daytime minimum load from 10 to 4. For two-axis tracking systems, they look at 8 to 6. And then for all others which can operate at night or any time of the day and year, they look at the full 24-hour minimum load. Clarifying exactly how, what time window this will be calculated over can have an important effect. So if you look at those numbers, as we mentioned, 80 to 90% of the failed applications that didn't pass in California failed because of that 15%. And of those that failed the 15%, somewhere between 20 and 40% were able to pass through supplemental review. So again, not every application is going to be a good candidate for this, but where it helps, it can be a very important addition. The last two screens, power quality and voltage, it looks at three pieces. It says, can you determine without the need for a CSER that voltage regulation will be fine? That flicker will not exceed the limit set by the new IEEE standard 1453 or similar standards, and can the harmonic injection be held within the limits of the IEEE 519. Again, this is a screen that looks at more detail than that simplified voltage test does, and mainly as a practical manner implements requirements that are within that Section 2 interconnection requirements. can you determine that they are met without the need for a full Caesar study. The last is the safety and reliability test. It asks the sort of overarching question, can you determine without the need for a Caesar whether there are any specific safety or reliability concerns? So as noted, the overarching goal that everyone shares here is to make sure that we maintain the safety and reliability of the distribution grid. And therefore, as a supplement to screens G and H, we have this final screen to make sure that there is nothing about the specific generation or the specific line to which it's connected that raises concerns. Given the unique questions this raises, there really is no way to word this in any more specific way, and therefore it has this intentional, rather expansive wording. California, in their Rule 21, gives some examples of the kinds of considerations that might go into this screen. Do you have a minimum load that's dominated by a small number of customers that might come offline and radically change the load profile? Are there even or uneven distributions of loading? Are you close to a substation or far away from a substation? What about the conductors that are used? So these kind of considerations will be taken into account in supplemental review, and if the utilities determine that a full study is required to evaluate any safety or reliability concerns, they will explain what those specific elements of the generation and line are that trigger this concern. So that's the end of my part. I'll turn this back over to Melissa to end with a brief discussion of the interconnection queue, because as mentioned, several of these screens require the utilities to take into account the aggregate DG, including what's in the queue ahead of you. So the queue has a really big role to play in how these screens will actually play out in the real world.
Great. Thank you, Bryce. And if we just want to stay with your slides, if you don't mind just tapping through the rest of them as we go, that would be fantastic. So great. So yes, so we wanted to touch on the state of the interconnection queue for exactly the reason that Bryce said, because it is so important to the implementation of this new process. If there is a lot of queued DG on the circuit with you, it becomes increasingly difficult to pass those screens. And if it is real projects, that's one thing. If it is leftover from the time where we did not have a way to get information about the queue, then that's a different matter. So just a really quick update on the queue. I know you all know what the queue is. It's the distribution queue for projects that want to connect to the distribution system in New York. A lot of it's solar, but it also has other types of DG and wind. Currently, the queue right now is not a real-time, cloud thing that you can go and look at, but it is published in the PSC document in the world of their documentation system. So there's a matter number there under the second bullet, 13-00205, which has the inventory to date that utilities update once a month. So as of the 1st of April, which is the latest data that we have, next update will be in mid-May, we have about 2,900 megawatts of solar and non-wind DG that is in the queue. So we have about, I believe it's around 400 and something that they have recorded as having been constructed and completed and interconnected. And then this 2,900 megawatts is stuff that is sitting in the queue in some state of processing. And so, this is a larger queue than we've had in the past. By no means have I seen, that it's out of line with where New York is heading and trying to go. It would be in excess of the net metering caps, which is 6% of 2005 peak generation in each utility territory, if they were currently being applied, but they are currently suspended as kind of the REV process, and a lot of other important proceedings are being completed. I think the big deal, though, is that this is all proposed generation that, as I mentioned, because there were no tools for getting information on circuits, a lot of developers that we've talked to have lots of stuff in the queue that is not real or not likely to go to a project or has some problem or another. So number one, that's a big concern, is that we're going to have to find a way to deal with that, because using this number to drive policy decisions when a lot of it is actually not real and it was there to get information is a problem. The second piece is we have not had any requirements for, site control or other things. So there's also just a lot of some speculation in the queue. People just looking at certain sites for information, but also just, hey, maybe I'd like to do something there at some point. And that's really, a lot of stuff in there is not necessarily real-term projects or feasible projects or projects that even have site control. So this is something I just wanted to share with everyone that we really want to get a handle on in the next few months so that we make sure that the new SIR process works as intended. Next slide, please. Great. So going forward, I want to just talk about a couple quick things. First, with where that left off is the interconnection queue management. As we mentioned, it really is critical to using all the processes and screens that we just talked about. There are two OMSBud persons, one from DPS and one NYSERDA, who are leading up this effort. And NYSEIA is going to be making some formal recommendations shortly, but some of the most important ones are that there is a requirement for site control. And we're going to be talking more about this, but something so that there is, some probability that this is a real project before you put an application in. Again, not for the pre-application report. The pre-application report should always not require site control, not require a customer, be able just to get information. But applications would potentially, one thought is to require site control to focus people and make sure we have, good solid leads for projects and less just speculation. The other piece is that we really want to encourage, of course, the using of the pre-application report so that you know what circuits are good, what circuits might be a good fit for your project. You should not be using the application process to look for information on a circuit. It sounds fine when it's just you looking for information, but when you start getting those reports back and there's people in front of you in the queue and you don't know who they are and you don't know if it's real, it can be frustrating and it really slows down projects. So we really want to encourage the use of the pre-application report and eventually what that will proceed on to become other things so that you don't get in the queue before you actually know that something is likely to be viable. We'll be adding, hopefully, we're recommending to add some more additional timelines. A bunch of the timelines in the current new updated SIR have teeth. You have to do this by this, and they're generally reasonable, or you are actually removed from the queue. Up to this point, there has been a very vague sense that you could be removed at the utility's discretion, typically only after 12 months. This is going to have, every part of the process has its own timeline with teeth after which you are removed. And then if there are some kind of, if there is some kind of buffer around some of those timelines, is there any ability for projects to move or hop over each other is something we would like to explore. So the queue management stuff, that's going to be a big focus. We welcome your ideas, suggestions, feedback, as I know NYSERDA and DPS do as well. We're really hoping to get something in place in the next couple months. Another thing going forward, dispute resolution. State and utility, the OMSBud people that we mentioned at the state level, and then each utility has their own, have been doing this in an active concerted effort for the last couple months. There has been a recent filing to reopen the docket just on this topic as well, to actually try to see if we could put dispute resolution process within the SIR itself. Next slide, please. And then one of the other things that I think you've probably heard about in passing is the starting of a new state-level interconnection technical working group, which just met again last Friday. The second meeting, it's 4 different representatives from the industry, including NYSEIA, and the 5 different joint utilities, and then it's co-chaired by Department of Public Service and NYSERDA. And this is really, these folks, this group has been brought together to solve a lot of problems, but with its primary focus or main focus on creating a best practice standards. There's going to be there are a number of technical things. They're just not particularly suitable to be dealt with explicitly in the SIR. And so we're working towards creating a separate document that's going to actually have best practice standards that will apply, to the utilities across the state, sharing what they do, but also standardizing what they do on some of the issues listed here on the slide, which include things like substation reverse power flow, remote monitoring and control requirements and issues, and anti-islanding is one of those things, voltage flicker and regulation. So they're important issues, particularly as you start to get higher penetrations of solar on particular circuits or particular substations. These become huge things, how to do them most effectively, how to do them cost effectively. And so there's been some good starting progress on these issues, and we will be codifying the results of those processes formally in a separate document that will sit hopefully side by side with the SIR. The last 2 things, enforcement mechanisms are also really important. I mean, I know I've heard from a lot of developers, timelines are great and it's really great to get some teeth in here and have a better queue management process, but what if I'm not getting things back in a timely fashion, or or et cetera? What do we do about that? Where is that going to evolve to? So I know that the Public Service Commission has been exploring for a couple of months what we're calling enforcement mechanisms, both penalties and incentives for utilities to meet the interconnection process timelines and cost estimates. And so they've been looking at doing that through REV. There's also some other options for how to actually implement a strategy like this, but we're looking forward to working with all of those stakeholders and the joint utilities on putting something in place for this that really just helps further, give incentive and funding for success to build capacity with the utilities, but also, holding folks to timelines. So if things are really out of sync with what's been mandated in the SIR, there is a way that will be, adjusted. There'll be some results or consequences from that. And finally, last but not least, a lot of you have heard about the distribution system implementation plans, the DSIPs for short, which are due at the end of June. It's the utilities submitting them as part of the REV process. And just one of the things that are coming out of them and will come out of them there are two things. One is the red zone maps, which are maps that several of the utilities are creating about areas, circuits in their jurisdictions that are particularly challenging for one reason or another. And they're actually trying to point those out ahead of time. So whether they have particularly large amount of queued DG, whether they have a lot of installed capacity, whether they have other limitations, they're working on, some of them have them out, some of them are working on creating them, which should be just a helpful kind of high-level guidance for developers. And then what the DSIPs are really actively going to work towards is the hosting capacity maps, which are kind of what would follow after the pre-application reports. Not this year, but something that's being worked towards, where it would be a real-time, much more real-time, dynamic, interactive system where you can actually log in and see all that information you get in a pre-application report for circuits across utility territories in a much more real-time fashion. And I think on that note, that brings us to questions. And I know that we have a couple of questions here that were typed in. Maybe, Bryce, if it sounds good to you, we'll answer those first and then see if there's any time for additional questions.
Yeah, no, that's great. So the first question was about whether we were going to focus today on systems less than 50 kilowatts. As Melissa mentioned, much of that process within the SIR has remained fairly similar. The really new pieces were all in the 50 kilowatts to 5 megawatts limits, and that's why we focused there. There was a second question. In general, how much solar or DG does the new screening process allow to be connected to a distribution circuit or network? The preliminary application, or preliminary screens have that 15% of the circuit section load. And below that, you can go directly to the interconnection, get your contract without required upgrades. If you exceed 15%, and again, by a little bit, and you have reason to believe the line is likely to have an actual minimum load above that, you can proceed to supplemental review, at which point you can go past the supplemental screens at 100% of the minimum circuit load. In addition to those questions, if you were to exceed the minimum load on a circuit, or if the circuit was the dominant circuit for a substation, there are other questions that may come up in a CSER study, where if you begin to have questions around what Melissa mentioned, the working group is looking at like backfeed into the substation, how much of the substation load are you likely to carry. In that best practice document that the working group is working towards, and in other ways it's going to publish and publicize its considerations, there are fractions of that substation load that will then trigger some high-cost upgrades depending on the configuration of the substation. So it's not easy to answer as a single question. But in terms of the preliminary and supplemental screens, those are pretty robust limits, 15% of peak section load, and then 100% of minimum circuit load for the supplemental review. The next question, let's see, was we've heard about solar and other DG projects being connected to network systems in Brooklyn, San Francisco, and other places. But National Grid has told us they're not possible on their system. What is the technical basis behind this? It is possible to connect to these types of systems in other jurisdictions that have these kinds of high penetration of solar. For instance, in California, in their version of Screen A, if you are connecting to a networked system, they do allow that explicitly under their screening analysis for spot networks where you are interconnecting less than either 5% of the spot network's maximum load or 50 kilowatts. And they take those two limits. So those kind of smaller systems are allowed under the screens, but with the explicit requirement that there be no possibility of backfeed out of that spot network. So again, there are possibilities. The screening methodologies are really here to say whether you can interconnect without further study, and these systems will generally require further study. In California, they do allow the very small systems that meet a small fraction of that peak load for a spot network to be interconnected under the screens. And so the last question, let's see, next question down. What Melissa mentioned it a little bit. The question had to do with the developers now have some of these hard timelines. If you miss that 30-day timeline or any of the others, you will be removed out of the interconnection queue. In terms of enforcement mechanisms, dispute resolution processes for the utilities, if they were to miss the timelines, those are processes that are still in development. The enforcement and incentive mechanisms live under a REV proceeding for revenue earnings enforcement. Earnings impact mechanisms is the title that they give to the proceeding that includes interconnection as one of many. Dispute resolution is currently an open question with that filing. If that proceeding reopens, the Public Service Commission would reopen that docket. The last question was for the pre-application report. Is the fee required when submitting this report or not until the report is returned to the installer? As Melissa mentioned, all of the timelines and the language in the SIR always has the trigger for the utility to start work as the receipt of the application fees. So the $750 is required at the beginning, and the date of the receipt of that $750 application fee is what triggers the 10 days for the pre-application report. Similar with all of the subsequent steps, the application itself, and then supplemental review if you request that.
Yep. And I can take a couple of these too, Bryce. I know there's a bunch more. We can maybe try to get through a couple more questions. I know we're about 4 minutes over, but just the next one was about developers getting involved in the technical working group, and we would definitely welcome that. The Department of Public Service and NYSERDA has tried to keep it to a group of a manageable number of people, but the idea is that number one, NYSEIA is happy to represent all of our members, and we're looking forward to further building out a process for doing that. One, you could absolutely be represented through NYSEIA, and Dr. Smith and I both serve as part of that technical working group, and would be happy to discuss any of these issues or other issues with you and take that straight to the working group. On a regular basis, though, we understand people want it to be transparent and visible, even if they can't necessarily be at the everyone can't be at the same table. So Department of Public Service and NYSERDA, they have the meetings are public. There's a link on their webpage which you click on, and you can see the upcoming meeting dates, the agendas when they're posted. You can call in and listen to the meetings, or you can attend in person. And so that was just rolled out for this last meeting on last Friday, but we'll hopefully continue to improve that transparency and visibility process as well. And then go ahead.
There was one technical question, and just to piggyback on what Melissa had mentioned, that right now, just like the phone call would be listen only, the participation is limited to that group. NYSEIA does hope to begin hosting our own kind of meetings with developers to be able to report back on what's happening at the working group and to more formalize that process of feedback to take your ideas to the working group as well. One of the questions was about the 15% and what defines a section. So within the SIR language, it speaks to automatic sectionalizing devices. So devices like a recloser, for instance, that would attempt to isolate a section. You want to consider what the DG on a section that might be open, because part of that 15%, for instance, was for things like anti-islanding questions. Similarly, the amount of existing aggregate DG that's on the line and in the interconnection queue should also reference only that section of the line that they're going to consider.
And yeah, I know that we will probably want to wrap it up and turn it back over to Valessa. There are a couple questions that we didn't get to. I mean, in general, just to recap, like all the timelines in the SIR, the 30-day one and others are always in business days, not in calendar days. And then there seems to be like a number of good questions on costs. You know, fee for Caesar studies range from, you know, $5,000 to $25,000 typically is what we've seen from a lot of developers. It looks like we can talk more about payments, that people are having challenges, you know, or just confusion about whether utilities accept anything but paper checks, but also whether what triggers the start of your process is the receipt of that check or when they actually cash that check. And so we'd be happy to follow up on that a little bit more. I don't think anyone's actually asked that nuanced question. It definitely is the payment, quote unquote, that triggers the timelines, but whether it's receipt or caching is a very good question. It would be great if everyone doesn't have a digital or online method for that. It would be really wonderful if that was something that we could help facilitate. Bryce, are there any other questions that you can see that you wanted to address quickly?
No, what I was going to suggest is, as was mentioned at the beginning, NYSEIA has created a sort of 10-page summary guidance document for using the SIR that goes into a lot of what we talked about today in greater detail. So we'll pull these questions. We'll try to see if any of them weren't already answered and add those to that guidance document, and that will be sent around to all participants with the slides for this as well.
Yep, that's a great point. And I do see that there are one or two questions on what's some of the work that's being done in the technical working group, like the anti-islanding stuff. So perhaps we've talked about doing either additional kind of webinar-like trainings or providing other resources so that we can help people discuss, be able to get information on those topics that are definitely currently being worked on at the state level. So with that, Valessa, why don't we pass it back to you just to wrap this up and finish out the webinar.
Sounds great. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Bryce. That was very helpful. And thanks to everyone who stuck around for 10 extra minutes. I know we didn't get to everyone's questions, so please feel free to email us directly. The emails are on the final slide that's posted. And I will follow up shortly with a copy of the slides. And as the recording becomes available, we will share that as well, in addition to the guidance document when it's prepared. So thank you again, and keep in touch.